Good evening, everybody. This is Fred Passman, and I welcome you to the 29 June 2023 edition of the Naval Order of United States Continental Commanderies Maritime History Virtual Lecture Series. I know many of you are well aware of the Naval Order and our history. For those who are our guests and visitors, I just want to note that the Naval Order is the United States' oldest hereditary, exclusively maritime focused society. Our mission is to promote, protect, preserve, and expand our nation's understanding of our maritime history, and to do so through means that build camaraderie amongst our companions. We have 19 local commanderies, and Continental is the odd duck in that we are a global commandery that services companions who do not live in areas close enough to any of the local commanderies. This evening, our guest speaker will be Professor Sarah Payne. She is the William S. Sims Professor of History and Grand Strategy and Policy Department at the U.S. Naval War College. She's been at the War College since the turn of the millennium. That's 2000. For those of you who don't know what a millennium is, and she has taught on topics as varied as the life of Mao Zedong, World War II, the Chinese Civil War, Russo-Japanese War, the Korean War, Vietnam engagement. Are we allowed to call that a war now? The Cold War. And during the period of her research, she spent more than 8 years abroad, really culturally immersing herself in Australia, China, Japan, Russia, Taiwan. Her publications are numerous, and they address various topics having to do with the relationships amongst these nations and naval strategies and operations. There's more on the website. Her full biography is there. And at this point, I want to welcome Sally aboard. Good evening, Professor Payne. How are you this evening?
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you. Before we go into your formal presentation, so what drew you towards maritime history?
Excuse me?
What drew you to your field of study?
2 jobs in one institution. My husband and I both got jobs at the Naval War College, and then I spent a great deal of time learning about navies, and it turned out they were incredibly important. And I spent my life studying 2 great continental powers, China and Russia, and teaching about maritime powers, Britain and the States. And all of a sudden, that opened all kinds of original research and ideas. So in life, the opportunities you get, some of them are transformative, and working at the Naval War College has been.
I know whereof you speak. Well, that's fascinating. So what were you studying before you came to the War College? Or let's say, going back to your dissertation.
Well, 2 small children immediately before, because I was a stay-at-home mom, but
Yeah.
that was a different event. My husband and I met in graduate school. We were the 2 insane people who thought we were going to make a career out of studying Russia and China, in those days neither doing well, which my brother described as 2 countries in the breakdown lane.
Right.
And then we spent year-long times in these various places in Japan and Taiwan as well, and working in the archives. And when you do that, you also talk to people and you learn about fundamental differences among countries.
Exactly. I think it's remarkable. You spend some time in a country and you get a very different perspective. Or one of the things I recommend to all junior officers, pick up a foreign country's history book and read their history of the United States. And it's very illuminating. Not everybody sees us through the same lenses as we see ourselves. But you've got a fascinating topic this evening, and I don't want to take up any more time. So I will turn the Deccan over to you and give you control. Look forward to listening to what you have to tell us about the end of the Cold War.
Okay, before I get going, I've got to make a disclaimer. This presentation represents my ideas. They don't necessarily represent those of the US government, the DoD, the Department of the Navy, let alone the Naval War College. So I hope we're good on that one. I'm going to answer a question today, or pose it and let other people answer it, is why did Russia lose the Cold War? And a lot of Americans answer this question saying, look, it was Ronald Reagan. He is the guy who did it. And the problem with that explanation is here you see Gorbachev's and the Reagans at the Reagan Ranch at the end of the whole thing. It looks remarkably cordial gathering for that sort of explanation. But in any case, if you believe Ronald Reagan won the Cold War, he was a man of words and deeds. And here he is before Parliament. The regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish a legitimacy, but not one regime has been able to risk free elections. Regimes planted by bayonets do not take root. And then a few years later, here he is in Berlin. He's standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, long a symbol of German greatness. It was a locked gate on the Berlin Wall when he's giving this talk. And he says, General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, open it up, tear down this wall. And who can forget his evil empire speech, which he gave to an enthusiastic group of evangelical Christians who gave up a day in Disneyland because they're all in Orlando to hear it. Reagan was also a man of deeds. He engaged in a really serious military buildup that had begun under President Carter, who had started it because of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And Reagan really put that on steroids and went at much more aggressive maritime patrolling strategy. He had a strategic defense initiative, and he's starting to spend more money in the military. And the Russians have a symmetric response. Beware of symmetric responses because they aren't as rich as we are. And they were trying to spend the way we were spending. Well, we had a much bigger economy. So all this added up to, I don't know, less than 8% of our budget. Nazi Germany, when it was in the midst of World War II, was spending up to 55%. Well, look at the Soviet Union in peacetime. If you look at their entire military industrial complex after the Cold War, they're estimating that it was 70%. That's economy busting. And I'm going to be quoting a lot of Russians this evening with you all because they've thought deeply about why their country lost the Cold War, the empire, and indeed life as they knew it. And here's Valentin Fallon. He was the Soviet ambassador for West Germany for a number of years. And he said, following the American strategy of our exhaustion in the arms race, our crisis in public health, educational matters, everything else comprising the quality of life, it reached a new dimension of crisis. And understand that while the Russians were having troubles with us, they're having even bigger troubles with the Chinese and had to militarize that whole border. And the arms race, he said, plunged the Soviet economy into a permanent crisis. And here is Russia's prime expert on the United States, Georgy Arbatov, who's saying, look, it became clear that the Afghan war was most advantageous for the United States. And we got our Vietnam, and we began to understand this. So that Gorbachev, a year after taking power, is telling the Politburo, maybe we should just stop being afraid of this missile defense of Ronald Reagan's. They're betting precisely on the fact that we're afraid of it. And that's why they're putting pressure on us to exhaust us. Correct. You got it right. So some would argue that the U.S. victory in the arms race guaranteed victory in the Cold War. So go Reagan. But I'm going to present a whole variety of counter arguments. So I've got the thesis here. It was Ronald Reagan who did it. And now I'm going to give you a whole series of first starting with external explanations, what other people did to the Soviet Union, and then internal explanations, what suboptimal things the Soviets were up to. And my first external explanation after the Reagan one is that it was all about Ford and the Helsinki Accords and Carter's human rights campaign. That's what really changed things. The Soviet Union had wanted to have a European-wide conference confirming its expanded World War II borders. It wanted this for years, and no one was interested. And then eventually, the Western Europeans are sick of all the drama. They want to have the conference. We don't want to go, but they're our allies, so we go. And then we insist on all these human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords, knowing full well the Soviets are never going to honor these things. Well, unbeknownst to us and anybody else, actually, human rights activists and dissidents across the West, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union began ever more vocally comparing the democracy and freedoms promised by communism and the actual dictatorship delivered. And they started demanding that their governments, if they're in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, start living up to the Helsinki Accords and start delivering these freedoms. And the dissident movement took on a life of his own. So afterwards, Robert Gates, who went on to become the head of the CIA and eventually DOD, said, you know, the Soviets, they desperately wanted this meeting, and it laid the foundations for the end of their empire. We resisted for years, only to discover much later that it yielded benefits beyond our wildest imagination. Go figure. So according to Gorbachev's English language translator, that this human rights was really important. It made Russians start thinking about that they needed to be more democratic and have more freedoms themselves. Here's Jimmy Carter's very famous address, commencement address at Notre Dame, where he says, we have reaffirmed America's commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. What draws us together is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than just financial prosperity. We are bigger than that. And so here you have Edward Shevardnadze years later commenting on the consequences of this. He's talking to Communist Party members on the foreign ministry, which he heads. The belief that we are a great country is deeply ingrained in me, but great in what? Territory, population, problems, having the highest infant mortality rate on the planet, or it's not easy answering the questions, who are you? Who do you wish to be? A country which is feared or a country which is respected? A country of power or a country of kindness? Vitaly Ignatyenko, a Russian journalist who covered both the rise and the fall of Gorbachev, believed that the Soviet Union fell apart because you just can't create a union on an undemocratic ideology. And the career diplomat Oleg Grinievsky agrees that, look, communist ideology is associated above all with the Soviet Union, and its rejection created a vacuum. And this is what determined its ultimate fate. And Boris Yeltsin, he is Gorbachev's successor. And he says, no one wants a new Soviet Union. Consensus, don't want to repeat that. So some would argue it's not about Ronald Reagan at all. The Cold War turned out as it did because the human rights clauses of the Helsinki Accords and Carter's subsequent human rights campaign that destroyed the communist belief in communism. Okay, another president, another counter argument. Others would say nonsense. It turned out the way it did. It's all about Richard Nixon. He played the China card. And others would say, no, it's actually Mao who played the America card. But either way, there was a Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 over various riverine islands. And in the midst of all this, the Soviets came to the United States and said, would it be okay if we nuke them? We said it would not be remotely okay if you nuke them. And Mao figured it out. The one that wants to nuke you is the primary adversary. And little minds think alike. And Nixon and Mao were into coordinating secret trips with Henry Kissinger off to Beijing. And then in 1972, you have Nixon's very public visit to Beijing, where the United States and China are going to coordinate to cause the Soviet Union problems. And think about it. All of these difficulties with China led to the militarization of the Soviet frontier. This is mechanized nuclear armed forces along this enormous frontier. Imagine if the United States had to pay for that kind of weaponry all along our Mexican and Canadian borders. It would be bankrupting. And yet Russia was doing this all along its European borders and now doing it with China in a much smaller economy than ours. So you could argue that US cooperation with China fatally overextended the Soviet Union, and that was that. Others would argue that actually it's a combination of all of these presidents, from Richard Nixon all the way to Ronald Reagan. They're each opening opportunities that the others play with increasing dexterity. So you start with Nixon, he plays the China card, and the others played even better. And then Ford comes in with human rights, the Helsinki Accords with human rights. Carter one-ups him with his human rights campaign, and then Carter begins a military buildup that Reagan finishes. So as a result, when you get to the end of Reagan's term, the United States is negotiating with the Soviet Union from a position of ideological and military strength. For those who believe that U.S. foreign policy is woefully inconsistent, I urge you to think again. Our foreign policy is relentless. It has been based on three core principles for over a century: free trade, democracy, and the containment of communism. And members of both parties have been supporting this for an awfully long time. So one could argue that Presidents Nixon through Reagan produced the cumulative presidential effects to defeat the Soviet Union. Another explanation is forget about all the dead former presidents. The real thing is actually a military platform that just changed the outcome of the Cold War. And this is nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines, because the Soviets had no counter for them. They couldn't find them. They believed that their second strike capacity, if there was a nuclear war, was no capacity, because our nuclear subs were targeting their nuclear subs, which in their home bastions. And when the Soviets are looking at all of this, here's Valery Bolden, a longtime aide of Gorbachev. He's look, the United States' most powerful strength is our naval fleet, and we can't have one because A, our geography is just not good, and B, we can't afford it. And then Marshal Yazov agrees. For the Americans, the main means for atomic attack was the fleet. So that when you have Admiral Akhrameyev, who would commit suicide upon the implosion of communism in Russia, he's visiting the United States in 1987, and he told his hosts, "We're surrounded. That's why we're concerned. We know you know where all of our submarines are, but we don't know where yours are, and that's destabilizing. You, the United States Navy, are the problem. Go Navy." His host, Admiral Trost, believed that the inability of the Soviet Union to maintain a strong defensive capability led to the end of the Soviet Union, that they just couldn't defend themselves. So one could argue the Soviet Union could not counter technologically or financially the U.S. submarine threat to its retaliatory nuclear forces, so war termination was their only solution. Okay, these explanations for why the Cold War turned out the way it did are all naval explanations. Naval spelled with an E, as in staring at one's own. They're all about what the United States did or did not do. And I'm now going to turn to some external explanations about what the Soviet Union, these are all external explanations of what others did to the Soviet Union. And I'm going to turn to internal explanations of what the Soviets did to themselves. Clausewitz talks about war being an interaction, and that you've got to study the other side, and you've got to study the game that's going on. You cannot just be fixated on yourself. Arnold Toynbee was one of the finest historians of the 20th century, and he argued that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. I've been talking about the murder, what other countries did to the Soviet Union. Now to turn to the suicide, what the Soviets did to themselves. Internal explanation number one: the implosion of the Soviet Empire was the cause, not the effect, of the loss of the Cold War. Everyone knows about the domino theory. Americans were all worked up about it in the 1960s and 70s. The idea was that if one democracy fell, a whole bunch of them would fall like a set of dominoes. Well, it turns out the theory doesn't apply to capitalist countries. It did apply to communist countries, because that is how they felt like dominoes. What happened in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc is in 88, 89, all sorts of demonstrations started taking place, starting in one Eastern European country, moving into another, and the contagion kept on spreading, and it kept getting worse. It turns out that Gorbachev's ideas about Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, rebuilding, resonated in his own country and also in Eastern Europe. And there were demonstrations everywhere in the Soviet Union for freedoms, personal freedoms, and in Eastern Europe, freedom from the Soviet Union. And they were also worried about their crumbling economies, because communism doesn't do well on economic growth. And Gorbachev, instead of sending tanks, encouraged the Eastern Europeans to do what Russia was doing, which is engaging in economic and political reforms. And the contagion began in Poland. Poland was the only Eastern European country to have an independent opposition movement, Solidarity, the workers' union. there had been serious workers' unrest periodically in Poland ever since the 1950s. In the early 80s, this is when Solidarity is founded, and then it gets really bad in the late 80s. Why? Because the Poles have been living off debt to maintain a really marginal standard of living, and the government couldn't repay these things, and the economy was imploding, and therefore it wanted to get rid of food subsidies and raise food prices. And so everybody hit the streets, and the government was in a panic that the economy would go in free fall. And so they offered Solidarity a place at the bargaining table if they would call off the demonstrations, which they did. A complicating factor in Poland was the Roman Catholic Church, an organization of great legitimacy, and a Polish pope in these years, and a partiality for Solidarity. So in February of 1989, Solidarity was asked to join these roundtable talks to decide what to do next. And they decide to hold elections. And those elections are held on exactly the same day that the Tiananmen demonstrations faced tanks and are ended in a bloody mess. In Poland, they hold elections because the Communist Party thinks they've got this one, that they've so rigged it they can't lose. Not quite. Solidarity won every seat but one for which it could compete. And for the communist designated seats where only communist members can compete, the box on the ballot called none of the above won for everything but 3 seats. So the legitimacy to rule of the Communist Party was gone. That was it. And 4 months later, there are massive demonstrations break out throughout Eastern Germany. This is around the 40th anniversary of the founding of Eastern Germany. And again, like Poland, very uncharacteristically, the communist government does not send tanks, which is what it always did. This guy, would-be tank man, turns out he'd already been booted from his job for incompetent economic mismanagement. And then on November 7th, the Council of Ministers resigns. And then on November 8th, the Politburo in East Germany resigns. And then on November 9th, whatever's left is issuing new travel rules. And enter fog, friction, and chance. This guy, Gunter Schabowski, who was a high party official, one of the ones who was left, he was giving a news conference that day. And instead of admitting he didn't know the answer to a question, he winged it. He was asked when the travel regulations go into effect. And he said, immediately. Immediately, crowds began massing at the 6 gates to the Berlin Wall. And at one of them, the border guards decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and they opened the gates. And with that, a pivotal decision, like the Polish elections, had been made. There's going to be no going back. Within the week, 9 million East Germans had visited West Germany. Within the month, 1% of the East German population had emigrated to West Germany. And Schabowski later said, we hadn't a clue that opening the wall was the beginning of the end for us. Okay, great planning. The Russians were really shocked at how rapidly the Eastern Europeans dumped them. And here's Yuri Rizhov, a scientist and parliamentarian, who said that of all our former satellites by compulsion, they cast us off as fast and as far as possible. And Anatoly Kovalyov, a deputy foreign minister for a very long time, said, and there was no confidence whatsoever concerning whom the East German army would shoot, us or the demonstrators. Same story for the Poles or Hungarian armed forces. I mean, with allies like this, if the enemy doesn't get you, the allies will. So you can make a very powerful argument that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War because unrest in the empire forced it to forfeit the Cold War. All right, here's a different explanation. It's if the satellites themselves had not been in an economic disaster zone, this sad story for the Soviet Union would not have happened. It's a different argument. So if you look at the world map circa 1960, you see all those tempting green places. They're about to become independent. And they're, generally speaking, absolutely sick of Western colonial powers and enter the Soviet Union with a program to put the West out of business. And there were many takers. Fast forward 20 years and look at all those pink places. The Soviet Union is on a roll. It's got all kinds of new friends all over the place. There's a problem for them. In the 1970s, most commodity prices tank. And these newfound friends depend on these commodity prices. So they're losing a third of their income. And then later, by the time you turn into the 80s, the price of oil starts going way down. And the Soviet Union depends on oil exports. So it could ill afford these non-performing pals who'd suddenly become a lot more expensive to have around. And then the story gets better. The Soviet Union's many nationalities also faced imploding standards of living, and they all rose up simultaneously in order to get out of the Soviet leash. And if you look at this ethnic map, if you have everybody trying to leave all at once, there are too many places to deploy the Red Army. So one could make another argument about why the Cold War ended as it did. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself in the Third World while ignoring its own internal Third World of nationalities, whose simultaneous revolts brought down the empire. Okay, another explanation is to say, look, the problem is strictly economics, that the Soviet Union had an absolutely failed economic paradigm. And that's why ultimately the whole place fell apart. And here are the economic statistics. You can look at their growth rates. They're really quite good after World War II, but then they go down, 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 down. So that for the 10 years prior to when Gorbachev took power, Soviet growth rates are between 1% and 2% less per annum than those of the United States and the West. And the compounding effects of that are huge. So that by the time Gorbachev's in the driver's seat, you got tanking industrial production, labor productivity, all these things are going down. And you may ask, well, how did that happen? Well, it turns out in communist systems, lying is incentivized. So if you're running a small enterprise, medium, big, or the government itself, you lie to all of your other enterprises as to how many resources and inputs do you actually have on hand. And why? Because you can't be guaranteed in the system that you'll be getting other inputs. So the result of this is all the macroeconomic data is bad. So people have no idea what the real value of labor, capital, what are consumer preferences actually, and what's productivity looking like? No one knows. So they're misallocating capital and labor at an incredible level. And it doesn't become apparent to everyone until they're in a full-blown crisis. And you can look what happens. Gorbachev comes into power in 85, and the Soviet economy goes off the cliff, and it doesn't bottom out until 1998. You can look what happens on Gorbachev's watch. The GNP is going into double-digit negative. It's not growing, it's shrinking. A huge internal debt growing, budget deficit growing, trade deficit. It's all a mess. So Marshal Yazov is his take. Look, we simply lack the power to oppose all these capitalist countries, all flourishing states that were united in the NATO bloc. We had to find an alternative to the arms race. And Anatoly Adamyshin, a foreign service officer, explains it this way. Our problems began with the departure from self-isolation. The Soviet Union was literally exhausted from the monstrous arms race, militarism, enemies with half the world. And Gorbachev said, look, we're encircled not by invincible armies, but by superior economies. And he repeatedly told people, living this way any longer is impossible. In other words, the Soviet economy lost the Cold War. Alexis de Tocqueville is one of the finest thinkers of the 19th century. What a wonderful book about the last days of the monarchy before the French Revolution, in which he has this pithy quotation that the most dangerous moment for a bad government is when it begins to reform, which is precisely what Gorbachev does. And Russians of all political persuasions agree on at least one thing, and that is Gorbachev was absolutely pivotal to why the Soviet Union unraveled the way it did. And it turns out he based his actions on certain false assumptions. One's identified here by the head of the Foreign Intelligence Department of the KGB. The thought never occurred to Gorbachev and friends that it's possible to withdraw from socialism, which is precisely what Eastern Europe did. Gorbachev's idea is you're capitalist, then you're socialist, then you're communist. Well, the East Europeans took a U-turn on that road. And in addition, for Gorbachev and the people who worked for him, for them, the clock had started ticking the moment that Gorbachev took power. But for the Eastern Europeans, the clock had started ticking a long time ago. That was when Stalin came in and shot their leaders and occupied the place. So here is Anatoly Chernyayev, a foreign policy advisor to Gorbachev. Gorbachev thought that bringing freedom to our Eastern satellites would lead them to adopt socialism with human face. But these countries brutally turned their backs on us. Really? If this is brutal, then what was Stalin? The politics in connection with our former friends were totally unexpected for us. Really? You move into a country, you shoot their leaders, you replace them with somebody else, you occupy them for years, you siphon off their resources, and you wonder why they don't like you. The United States intervenes in people's civil wars the world over, and we even provide massive economic aid, and we even leave, and people don't like us. So I don't know why the Russians think they're so special. A third assumption, here's Gorbachev telling the Politburo, the Americans will definitely dissolve NATO because there will be no Warsaw Pact. So his idea is if there's no Warsaw Pact, there's going to be no NATO. And if there's no Comecon, that's the Eastern European Trading Bloc, there's going to be no European community, which eventually becomes the European Union. Well, he doesn't get it, that voluntary and involuntary associations dissolve for different reasons. And then there's another assumption. Gorbachev takes the continental power view of the world, which is you don't want strong countries. You try to break them up. So he assumed the United States would be like that and would oppose German unification. So while all these demonstrations are going on in East Germany, he takes a vacation. Poor life choice. Because Bush and Chancellor Kohl of Germany at that time were engaged in a fast tracking of German unification and to put Germany into NATO. Okay, Gorbachev's closest advisors, by the end of it all, many of them have concluded that his foreign policy mistakes, and theirs actually as well, but anyway, were a function of his domestic policy mistakes that had led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this America expert, Lukin, saying Gorbachev was no Deng Xiaoping being the author of China's very successful economic reforms, and Arbatov, another America expert, why did the Soviet Union fall apart? The stupidity of its leaders. So it was suicide by mistake. The big bozo was playing with plastic bags. He stuck one on his head, and that was that. For the Russians, this was hard. Lukin said, look, in the West, they love Gorbachev because everything took place so easily and cheaply, basically that way. But for us, it was expensive. Yeah. But Stalin was even more expensive. It was time to reassess. Others would make a different argument. They'd say, look, it's not about Gorbachev's sins of commission. It's about the army's sins of omission. Think about it. Deng Xiaoping sent the tanks, and communism is alive and well in China today. So the key fault was that Gorbachev and friends should have sent the tanks to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself if necessary. So the real problem, why did things turn out the way they did? It's timely tank deployments, TDD, my contribution to military acronyms, would have changed the outcome of the Cold War, but it was not to be. Others would argue, no, the real failure in leadership is not Gorbachev or the army, but this charmer, Yeltsin, who's Gorbachev's replacement. Yeltsin comes in, he removes Article 6 of the Constitution, which had guaranteed the communist monopoly of power. And after he removes it, this means you can have parties competing. And then the following year, he represents Russia and gets together with the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine, and they signed the Belovezh Accords in 1991, and they dissolved the Soviet Union. So it was suicide on purpose. They signed these accords, and that was that. All right, I'm now going to make a couple of umbrella explanations, and they're two really basic ones. One is any of the above. That the Cold War ending the way it did was inevitable, and the other is the opposite. It took all of the above, that the West barely won. So starting with any of the above, you can look at the Soviet Union's problems to make an argument, say any one of them was a time bomb, that when it went off, it was going to be over. It wasn't any particular president. It was just the whole economic mess. Think about it. The reason why the United States was against communism was because it was a brutally ineffective economic system. And by the end of it, the Soviets agreed. They didn't want it either. So here's a journalist who covered the rise and fall of Gorbachev saying, look, the main reason for the collapse has to do with the rottenness of the system. That's my missile, my actual rocket scientist. Now for the journalist, who wrote, I think from the beginning, the genes of disintegration were contained in the genetics of this governmental political formation. Don't you love the communist way with words? Don't ever write like that. So under this umbrella explanation, the Soviet Union was destined to lose. But then here are others who take the opposite view, and back to Kovalyov, our deputy foreign minister. Thus, all factors merged, internal, ideological, economic, military, in order to end the Cold War, to arrange for the Cold War's funeral feast. You remove any one of these factors, and the Cold War would not have ended on Western terms. So in other words, the West barely won the Cold War, so be grateful. And now I'm going to give you a twist on that argument. You could argue that in addition to having all the unfortunate events happen to the Soviet Union, you need in office at the same time Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany and George H.W. Bush of the United States, two of the finest leaders of the 20th century. George Bush Sr. was probably one of the most qualified people ever to occupy the Oval Office. He was a very young war hero. And then he goes on to, after the war, to graduate from college, does very well at Yale. And then he leaves his East Coast roots to move to Texas and becomes an offshore oil millionaire doing in the Gulf of Mexico. And then he's elected public office as representing a district in Texas. And he goes on to be ambassador to the United UN, representative of the PRC, director of the CIA, and then an 8-year understudy to Ronald Reagan. His opposite number, Helmut Kohl, is equally qualified. Kohl started out by getting a PhD in politics and history. He, like Bush, he goes into business, does well, and then he enters politics, starting at the local level and working his way up. So in the end, he is the longest serving chancellor in Germany at that time, ever since his very illustrious predecessor, Otto von Bismarck. He was the head of his own political party for a quarter of a century. And he came to the conclusion that he was going to buy up East Germany, one tourist at a time. Turns out the East Germans love to travel. And West Germans could always travel to East Germany, but the reverse wasn't true because East Germans, when they got out, had a habit of staying. Nevertheless, the East German government started letting more travel. And you might ask why? And the answer would be money. The West Germans paid them all kinds of money. And this was the program to let people out. And here are how the deals worked. So in 1988, East Germany eases travel restrictions, and then the West Germans start giving them a lot of money. So $500 million Deutschmarks, to getting closer to $1 billion Deutschmarks. And then Hungary opens its borders to Austria for East Germans who could already travel to Hungary. Well, now they can go straight into Austria and they're out. And West Germany gives Hungary a lot of cash, right? $500 million Deutschmarks. And then in November 89, you have Kohl with his 10-point unification program. And think about it, this is against the backdrop of all these demonstrations. And then he starts paying money directly to the Soviet Union, whose economy, as I've already shown you, was into double-digit shrinkage. And this money is essential for Gorbachev to maintain social stability. Nevertheless, the demonstrations keep on going and they get worse and worse. And this is when Kohl and Bush are looking at the world and going, we had better fast track unification before Gorbachev falls from power. And that turns out to be difficult because there are a lot of people against doing that. Gorbachev is absolutely against, he doesn't want to unify Germany, much less a Germany and NATO. US State Department experts on Germany are urging a go slow approach. Genscher, who is the foreign minister of West Germany, is really skeptical about of Germany being in NATO. And he can't be fired. Why? Because he represents a political party different from Kohl's party, and it's a coalition government, so you got to keep Genscher around. And meanwhile, Britain and France are absolutely skeptical about German unification. Why? Once Germany's unified, it's going to be the largest economy in Europe. They're going to be in second fiddle status, and they don't much like that idea. So Kohl and Bush do a division of tasks. Kohl is going to focus on reassuring the Soviet Union, and he's going to work out the financial reunification. The Soviets are thinking of, well, if you're going to reunify a place, it's going to be done by the military, right? Wrong instrument of national power. Once the whole Germanies are both operating on Deutschmarks, which are minted in West Germany is going to control the piggy bank, and that will make all the difference. Meanwhile, Bush is going to play the diplomacy with Western allies. There are a whole bunch of meetings that are supposed to happen, and Bush is trying to delay them for as long as possible to allow reunification to progress as far as possible before giving Britain or France a chance to veto any of this. And meanwhile, both Bush and Kohl are doing tag team diplomacy much faster than Gorbachev can really react to it. And how does that work? In February, Gorbachev agrees to German unification. And now the money really flows. Kohl pays Gorbachev 5 billion Deutschmarks. And then in May, Gorbachev agrees that states can choose their alliances. That means you can decide whether you want to join NATO or not. And that means Germany's going to join NATO. In return for that, the United States offers his 9 assurances and concludes a trade agreement that Gorbachev really wanted. And then July, really busy month. The German Economic Union goes into effect. It's Deutschmark for all Germans. And this is when you have the London Declaration inviting Eastern Europe to think about NATO. And this is when the G7 summit is going to agree about fast-tracking economic aid to the Soviet Union, which is desperate. Gorbachev agrees to all of Germany in NATO. And then Germany, in return, confirms the Polish border, which is a big deal. And Germany gives loads of cash, 15 billion. And he also pays for all the new housing for the repatriated soldiers who are coming back from the Soviet Union, from Eastern Europe. And you may go, why are they wasting money on that? You don't want these soldiers running a coup when they get home. You want them busy running around the department store trying to buy furnishings for the new apartments. And finally, in September, this is when the Treaty on German Unification is signed. But here's the trick. This is Polish, the Polish border that was so important. As Stalin played map games, he moved Poland far to the west. It's not the normal thing to do to a country. And so Germany lost 1/3 of its pre-war borders, and 12 million Germans were made refugees as they're being shipped back to the new Germany, and 2 million of them died. Well, Germany agrees to accept these new borders. Okay, while all this is going on, a month and a half before the German Unification Treaty is signed, Saddam Hussein takes into his head that he's going to invade Kuwait, and that's a problem. Iraq is one of the Soviet Union's most important client states, and Iraq owed the Soviet Union between 10 and $13 billion. That's a big hunk of cash for a country, a creditor that is absolutely broke. And remember that until all the Soviet troops are out of Eastern Europe, which doesn't happen until 1994, the Cold War termination is not a done deal. So the United States did a lot of diplomacy with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev was on board to get Saddam out of Kuwait. And he sends his envoy, Primakov, to Iraq, 3 different trips. On the first trip, Primakov gets all the Soviet hostages out of Iraq. On the second trip, he gets all Western hostages out. Third trip, not so lucky. He's there for the bombing. Imagine in this bombing campaign if you have Western human shields going down with every bomb dropped. Well, the Soviet Union meant that didn't happen. However, they're doing other cooperation as well and making their own calculations. And here's Sergei Tarasenko, an aide to Foreign Minister Shevardnadze. So look, we understood the United States wasn't going to sit by and let Saddam keep Kuwait. And so you want the United States to act unilaterally, or wouldn't it be better to have the United States funnel everything through the Security Council, where the Soviet Union has its own veto? And there was a division of roles. The United States asked the Soviet Union to deal with China. And they made the point to the Chinese, hey, you want the United States acting unilaterally, or you want to funnel it through the Security Council where you have veto power? And so that's how that worked. But the Soviets had red lines. And here it is from the Deputy Foreign Minister. I advance a basic principle that we must support the territorial integrity of Iraq. It's our sacred position, i.e., there is going to be no march on Baghdad. This is why Bush called off the ground war at 100 hours. He does not want this dictator, Saddam, tanking Cold War termination in Europe. He just simply wants Saddam out of Kuwait, and once that's done, we're good enough. Now, maybe these two, Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain and François Mitterrand of France, would have liked to have Cold War termination tanked. Not to be. Mitterrand eventually came around, and he played an instrumental role in expanding the European community, which was Western Europe, to the European Union, which includes Eastern Europe as well. negotiating the Maastricht Treaty. He was instrumental in that. But Margaret Thatcher never came around. The British had given lip service that they were for German unification, but when the time came, they weren't. And Thatcher said, look, Germany will be like Japan of Europe, but worse than Japan. I'm guessing she hadn't been to Japan lately. She said the Germans will get in peace what Hitler couldn't get in the war. She wanted to maintain Red Army troops in Germany for the duration. Great, Margaret. Imagine dealing with Putin today if you have a divided Germany or even a unified Germany with Red Army troops in there and not a member of NATO. It would be a mess. And Bush and Kohl saved us from that problem. And at the end of the Cold War, Bush told Helmut Kohl, look, I'm not going to beat on my chest and dance on the Berlin Wall and brag how we won this thing. And they both were very careful not to humiliate Gorbachev because they understood if they did that, he might have fallen from power much earlier. The hardliners might have come to power much earlier. As it was, there were 20 years when Russia was basically absorbed at home as opposed to meddling with all these very weak Eastern European governments. So they had 20 years in order to integrate with the West economically, politically, and militarily. So Bush could never brag about his greatest achievement. So he was not reelected. Bill Clinton comes on in, but he will go down in history, I believe, as one of America's finer presidents. So if you ask, well, who ended the Cold War, according to Anatoly Adamyshin, a Soviet foreign service officer, well, it's Soviet Union. The Soviet Union called it off. And Edwin Meese, Reagan's longtime advisor and attorney general, agreed. He said the Cold War began because of Soviet policies, and it ended in a sense because of Soviet policies. And so the Nobel Committee agreed. They gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Gorbachev, not Bush, for the liberation of Eastern Europe. So when you're pondering this question of why the Cold War turned out the way it is, I hope you will make a more complicated answer than Ronald Reagan did it. And if you put the Navy into the context of all this, it's terribly important. But look at all the other instruments of national power that were necessary to go along with it. So with this ends my prepared remarks for you all, and I'll try to unshare my screen.
That was breathtaking, fascinating. There's so much nuance that most of us, I don't think we're even aware of. So thank you so much for I felt as though I was drinking from the fire hose. And, sometimes I think, well, I know a little bit about this history, but amazingly, you shed some real light. Early in your presentation, you made a comment about how communist type of regimes can't persevere, and it called to mind China's 100-year plan, which, if I look at what I heard about it when it was in year 25 and I was an ensign and the briefings were still top secret, and I look at now year 75, it's to me, it's quite disconcerting how close to their projections they continue to fall as they develop. But you made some comments about the weaknesses of their strategy as well. Could you speak to the difference between the Soviet Union's take on communist leadership and China's?
Well, number one, Russia has never had a vibrant commercial tradition. Under the czars, it was all about czarist monopolies. And it goes back to the Mongols. And you can see Putin doing it and the Wagner Group doing it. It's all about doing a take. The Silk Route went through Russia, and you take it. The Russians were the tax collectors of the Mongols. And that's what they did. They go to Africa, you get a cut, you get a take. You're not actually creating wealth, you're stealing someone else's wealth. Okay, China's always had a vibrant commercial tradition. People have always coveted China's manufacturers, right? And we do today. People did, the goods changed, but that hasn't changed. For a long time, when Deng Xiaoping took power, what was necessary to help fix the economy and what was necessary to maintain communist control ran in parallel. And so they opened all kinds of things up, and the economy grows and does really well. But now they've caught up enough so that the choices are now zero sum. You either are going to keep the Communist Party monopoly on power, and in order to do that, you got your 24/7 surveillance state, And you're going to, in order to justify that, you're going to be enemies with the world, et cetera. And you're going to be cutting down on people's connectivity with the world, or you're going to open it up and say, we need to do a multi-party system. And Xi Jinping has chosen. And you can look, he makes every bad choice there is. You can just sit there and go, okay, what's the next stupid one you're going to do? And for him, it'll keep him in power. And it may keep the communists in power for a long time. But their growth rates are tanking. The Chinese are not having children now. It's called they don't have faith in their own country. Apparently, I just read they have lower birth rates now than they did during the Great Famine. How do you do that?
Right. Yeah. And then that whole business where that two-child restriction, and now that's coming to haunt them. And so initially the government imposed restrictions on birth rates, and now people are voluntarily thinking, why would we want to bring a child into this? That's a wonderful point.
After COVID, that's what people concluded. I'm not bringing a child into this mess.
Right. So John posed a fascinating question here. He says, in Stanley Kubrick's movie, Dr. Strangelove, which we all know and love, the Soviet-Russian ambassador character explains the doomsday machine as a cost savings measure for national defense. The Russian government could not compete with the USA in military affairs while meeting the demands of the people for consumer goods. Is it your internal causation theory basically the same as the movie's plotline? Thank you, John.
Well, actually, what's funny about the doomsday machine was the reason we got into nuclear weapons originally is because we found conventional forces too expensive. So Mr. Strangelove has inverted it, what it originally was. Of course, that movie's partially based on truth, or it wouldn't resonate as a good movie.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
And I think of the self-destructive or the nationally destructive work of Mr. Stalin, and the talent pool that he purged from the Soviet Union. Again, we can get into a lot of what ifs, but had he not been so aggressive at purging his intellectual talent pool, might the Soviet Union's post-Stalin history been a bit different as well?
But has Russia ever not been like this?
That's also true.
You look at it, and it has periods of liberalization. You think, oh, finally they're going to get over it. And they don't. And part of it has to do with they have a continental location, and therefore they can be invaded from everywhere, and therefore they're going to have a large army. And that large army is going to be in the capital. And that large army is going to probably tell the government about what kind of economic policies it wants, and it wants a wartime economy, right? So the security fears are real, and it's only with the advent of the Industrial Revolution where you can have compounded growth if you trade with people instead of shooting them up. And the Russians haven't come around, and nor have the Chinese come around.
That's right. And you look, we have two large borders, not nearly as large as the Soviets' land borders. And we, by and large, at least since the 1920s, chosen trade rather than militarization of our borders. On the southern border, we had some rough edges up until the, let's say, till the first third of the 20th century. But Canada, for at least the past 175 years, it's been strong trade relationships.
Broaden it to the West. Think about Germany and France. They used to be at each other's throats forever. And we have come to, and also Korea, and think about who our allies are. We've all come to terms with it. If you want to destroy wealth, the fastest way there is go to war with somebody. And the way to really do it is just trade. You have these rules. You don't like the rules. You go to the UN and you start negotiating with each other, et cetera. That is the way that produces wealth on an unbelievable scale. And you look at Putin's giving you a lesson of the alternative. He has destroyed so much wealth. Whatever, if he wins, he was going to get embers, right?
I think that goes right to the next question was posted. To what extent is the obvious technological superiority of Western weapons in the first Iraq War instrumental in convincing Soviet leadership that they couldn't compete militarily with the West?
I think it was a big, I'm sure it was a big piece of it, but by the time that happens, the Cold War is already over. Think about it. The Gulf War is happening as everything's imploded. So, but it's
Right.
China who reads that one and goes, whoops. And we need to get all these weapon systems in. That's China's lesson, is that we need to work on all this. The real lesson is you're much better squabbling with each other at the UN
Right.
than doing these other things. These other things, the most inefficient way to solve a problem is to go to war with somebody. On the other hand, if someone goes to war with you, you're stuck, which is where the
Right.
Ukrainians are.
Right. And following up with that, then, Soviet Union collapsed pre-internet. And of course, we had Radio Free America and other ways of getting communications that way. And we grossly overestimated Soviet Union's capabilities, almost hysterically sometimes. And then once they collapsed, we said, "Oh, it was a mulligan." How important was the imperfect flow of information across the Iron Curtain in Soviet Union's collapse?
I think what's really, let's flip it around. I think for dictators, they've got to monopolize information, or they got to, like Putin, to stay in power right now, he needs more information than the people who might want to out him. This is key to dictators. And so this was a problem for the Soviet Union when there was Radio Free Europe that's coming right on in, and people would listen to it and they go, yeah, this sounds much more plausible than the nonsense we're being fed. So the information is key, and Putin has been excellent at manipulating it. He's really good. Russians really understand the jealousies of other people. So they're very good at destabilizing all of their neighbors. They just know how to play on people's jealousies, or you assassinate someone here and there and blame the wrong person. It can be profoundly destabilizing. And that's why our information campaign in the Ukraine war has been finally a comeback of Americans finally get with it.
Right.
We disbanded all of that with the end of the Cold War. We had a very robust information campaign out there, but then we got rid of it. Meanwhile, the Russians were doing RTV for the last 10 or 15 years, and we were just fat, dumb, and happy. And now we realize, whoops. So, but we're back.
Yes, it's a slow learning process, and I call that engagement, our tar baby engagement, from the very outset, that there was no way for us to go into Iraq and extricate ourselves unless we were planning on another Marshall Plan type long-term commitment.
Marshall Plan is about rebuilding states that had already had modern economies. If you're getting into Iraq, you're talking about building something that had never existed before. Also, there's another key. Iraq and Afghanistan are continental positions. They have all kinds of what I would call veto players. What's a veto player? They may not be able to win, but they can prevent you from winning. Right. And if you've got Pakistan and Iran and whoever else is out, Russia out there, they're going to keep it churning forever. So it won't be the fault of your development program. It's just not going to happen when you've got veto players all around. But you need to be smart before you go in to look at the map.
Absolutely. Well, again, Professor Payne, I want to thank you for a fascinating hour. We're coming up to the top of the hour, and I just want to spend the last couple of seconds letting everybody know that our next virtual lecture will be on the 20th of July, same time. We'll start promptly at 1900, and we'll have retired Captain Michael Tilley, United States Navy retired, also former Attorney General of the state of Hawaii. And about to sneeze. Excuse me. And discuss the Spanish having discovered Hawaii, not Captain Cook. So we look forward to another fascinating, exciting lecture next month, and hope we have the same kind of. We had actually a tremendous turnout this evening. So thank you once again, and that will conclude our broadcast.